Imagine a nation with a history stretching back millennia, a place that's home to over 80 distinct ethnic groups. And right now, it's navigating this really pivotal moment, one that could reshape the entire Horn of Africa. Today, on the Deep Dive, we're plunging into Ethiopia. It's a nation truly at a critical crossroads. And our mission for this deep dive, well, it's to take this stack of sources, we've gathered articles, research our notes, and really pull out the most important nuggets for you. We want to help you quickly get up to speed on Ethiopia's incredibly complex sociopolitical dynamics, its historical power structures, and its profound geopolitical significance.
Yeah, and we've really cast a wide net with the sources, everything from, deep scholarly analyses of Ethiopia's past to very specific, sometimes harrowing, case studies detailing recent conflicts and their humanitarian impacts. What really jumps out from this material is that Ethiopia's complexity isn't just about its diversity. It's about this inherent tension between these ancient imperial legacies and the very modern attempts to manage that diversity. And often those attempts have had some pretty serious unintended consequences.
Right. So why does this matter to you listening right now? Well, Ethiopia's internal situation, its external relations, they have these really profound implications for regional stability, for international security.
Absolutely. We're talking impacts on global trade routes, think the Red Sea nearby, counterterrorism efforts, which have been a big focus for Western powers, and just broader humanitarian concerns across the continent.
It's a place where local issues can and do ripple outwards very quickly, becoming global concerns. All right, let's start to unpack this complexity. Ethiopia is just this incredible mosaic of identities, home to over 80 distinct ethnic groups, as we said.
Is it really quite something?
Yeah. And just to give you a sense of scale, the largest group are the Oromo. They make up roughly 34 to 36% of the population. Then you have the Amhara, around 24 to 27%. And then the Somali and Tigray groups, each hovering around, say, 6 to 7%.
And that diversity, while culturally incredibly rich, it's also been this persistent source of tension, specifically over how power is distributed, who gets what, who calls the shots.
Exactly. That tension over power distribution, it's like a central thread running through Ethiopia's modern history.
It really is.
And if we look back, that power wasn't always spread out, even theoretically. Historically, it was, well, pretty concentrated, mostly in the hands of the Amhara elite.
Right. And maybe the Tigrayans to a lesser extent, depending on the period.
Yes. During the imperial era, and then later under the Derg regime that was the military junta that took over in the 70s, the Amharic language, Amharic culture, they definitely enjoyed a privileged status.
Which, often came at the expense of other ethnic groups feeling marginalized, their languages suppressed, their culture sidelined. This obviously created some very deep-seated grievances.
Grievances that didn't just disappear.
Not at all. So the big challenge became, how do you integrate all these diverse groups? How do you address those historical imbalances, especially after periods of very centralized, sometimes oppressive rule?
And this is where things get really interesting politically. 1991. The Derg regime is overthrown by the EPRDF, that's the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front.
A coalition, crucially, of ethnic-based movements. And it was spearheaded, really dominated by the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
Right, and they introduced this radical shift, a system of ethnic federalism. It got formally written into the 1995 Constitution.
What this did was reorganize Ethiopia into 9 regional states, the Kililok, which were largely based on ethnicity.
Now, this wasn't just, tweaking administrative boundaries. This was presented as a fundamental experiment. Theoretically, it granted these regions significant self-governance, the stated aim, to fix that historical marginalization.
It was a bold move, no doubt, but it immediately sparked this intense debate. And that debate continues today, really. Proponents argued, look, this is essential. It's the only way to keep a country this diverse together. It empowers communities that were shut out before.
But the critics?
Critics had a very different take. They argued it actually solidified ethnic divisions, it politicized identity, made it the main currency of politics instead of fostering national unity. And they often pointed out that in practice, the TPLF maintained a tight grip on power within that EPRDF coalition. So how much real autonomy did these killas actually have? That was the question.
Then fast forward to 2018. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed comes to power. He's an Oromo, which was significant in itself. And initially, his arrival sparked these huge hopes for more inclusivity, for real reform.
That hope was palpable. You could feel it. But his subsequent efforts moved towards, fostering a more centralized, unified national identity. He dissolved the old EPRDF coalition, formed the new Prosperity Party, and this move, the centralizing push, met with pretty significant resistance,
Especially from whom?
particularly from the Tigrayans, from the TPLF. They saw it as a direct assault on the autonomy and influence they'd held for decades. And this divergence, this fundamental disagreement over the direction of the country, ultimately became a major contributing factor to the devastating Tigray War.
So it really highlights this persistent struggle, doesn't it? This back and forth between forces trying to centralize power and those pushing for decentralization or regional autonomy.
Exactly. It's a core tension.
Which brings us to, well, the stark reality of conflict. Ethiopia faces these significant risks of destabilization. It's not just the diversity itself, but the politicization of that ethnic identity.
Right. Amplified by those historical grievances we talked about and this ongoing struggle over the state structure, that's what makes it such a volatile mix, a potential powder keg, as some sources put it.
Let's talk about how these fractures manifest. The Tigray War is the most prominent recent example, tragically.
Absolutely. It erupted in November 2020, pitted the federal government, crucially, supported by Eritrean forces and Amhara regional forces against the TPLF.
The immediate trigger, often cited, was a TPLF attack on federal military bases in Tigray.
Yes, that was the spark. But the tinder had been accumulating for a long time. The deeper roots are in those long-standing political tensions between the TPLF, used to being dominant for nearly 30 years, and Abiy Ahmed's government pushing reforms that sidelined them.
And the human cost.
Oh, devastating. The sources we looked at paint a horrific picture: widespread displacement, millions needing aid, famine conditions in parts of Tigray, credible, widespread allegations of severe human rights abuses.
Things like mass killings, sexual violence.
Exactly. Horrific sexual violence used as a weapon of war, deliberate destruction of infrastructure, hospitals, schools. The casualty estimates, well, they vary, but they're certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Direct conflict deaths, yes, but also from starvation, lack of medical care.
It's just staggering. And beyond the immediate human suffering, the regional implications.
Profound, drawing Eritrea directly into Ethiopian affairs in a major way, shaking the stability of the entire Horn of Africa. It really underscores that Ethiopia's internal conflicts don't stay internal for long.
And the Tigray War, horrific as it was, didn't happen in a vacuum. It also, in a way, shone a light on other deep-seated tensions across Ethiopia that continue to simmer.
That's a really important point. For instance, the Tigray-Amhara tensions, they didn't end with the Pretoria Peace Agreement. There's persistent animosity, particularly over these disputed territories in western Tigray.
You mentioned Welkite, Seged, Raya.
Precisely. Amhara forces occupied these areas during the war, claiming they're historically Amhara land. The TPLF obviously disputes this vehemently. It remains a major flashpoint.
And then there are Oromo-Amhara tensions as well.
Yes, recurring intercommunal violence often flares up between Oromo and Amhara communities. Sometimes it's about land disputes, competition for resources. Other times it taps into deeper historical grievances. And it's complex because even with an Oromo prime minister, some Oromo nationalist factions feel their demands for greater autonomy haven't been met. So there's ongoing conflict involving groups like the Oromo Liberation Army, or OLA.
Are there religious dimensions too?
There can be. While Ethiopia has a long history of relative religious coexistence, there are instances of localized tensions, sometimes violent, between Orthodox Christians and Muslims. These incidents, while often localized, are unfortunately susceptible to political manipulation and can be exploited to deepen divisions.
Now, Ethiopia has tried to manage these things. Mechanisms exist, right?
Yeah.
Like ethnic federalism itself, which was intended to manage diversity, mediation efforts like the African Union-led Pretoria Agreement that ended the main fighting in Tigray, national dialogue initiatives.
Right. They've certainly tried various approaches, but the results have been, well, mixed at best. Ethnic federalism, as we discussed, is deeply controversial. Mediation efforts like Pretoria stopped the worst of the fighting in Tigray, which is hugely significant, but it didn't resolve the underlying political issues, like the status of Western Tigray. And look at the ongoing conflicts in Amhara and Oromia regions after the Tigray peace deal. It shows these mechanisms have either had limited effect or, in some cases, might have inadvertently exacerbated divisions because of how they were designed or implemented. Lack of genuine power sharing, perceived injustices, these remain huge challenges.
It feels like putting patches on a fundamentally fractured system sometimes.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. The underlying issues often persist and just manifest in new ways.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Beyond the internal dynamics, let's look outwards. Ethiopia's geopolitical position. It holds significant strategic value, doesn't it? Its location in the Horn of Africa.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
The Horn sits astride major global shipping lanes, especially connecting the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. It's vital for global trade, energy security, and it's been a key area in counterterrorism efforts.
And Ethiopia itself, despite being landlocked since Eritrea became independent in '93.
It remains a heavyweight player. You've got a huge population, over 120 million people, considerable economic potential, though facing challenges, and this long history of being an influential regional power. So, what happens in Ethiopia matters immensely to the entire region.
Let's drill down into some key aspects of that strategic value. First, Red Sea access. That seems like a constant preoccupation.
It is. Being landlocked is a major economic and strategic constraint. So Ethiopia is persistently trying to secure reliable, affordable access to seaports. Djibouti has been the main corridor for decades, but it's expensive. Ethiopia has been exploring other options, most notably with Somaliland and the port of Berbera.
And that recent memorandum of understanding with Somaliland caused quite a stir, didn't it?
A huge stir, especially with Somalia, which considers Somaliland part of its territory. It highlights how this quest for sea access isn't just economic, it's deeply political and can create new regional tensions. It's about projecting influence, too.
Okay, second key aspect, regional stability. You touched on this, but how direct is the impact of Ethiopia's internal situation on its neighbors?
Very direct. Instability in Ethiopia can trigger massive refugee flows into Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, Somalia countries, often already struggling to cope. It can disrupt vital trade routes that the whole region relies on. And crucially, instability or conflict can create vacuums that extremist groups like al-Shabaab operating nearby might exploit. So a stable Ethiopia is really seen as an anchor for the entire Horn. An unstable Ethiopia risks dragging the region down with it.
And the third big one, the Nile River.
The Nile, yes. Ethiopia is the source of the Blue Nile, which provides the vast majority of the Nile River's water downstream. The construction and now the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, has massive geopolitical implications, especially for Egypt and Sudan, who rely heavily on Nile waters.
Leading to some very tense diplomatic negotiations.
Incredibly complex and often acrimonious negotiations. It's a high-stakes issue involving water security, national pride, and regional power dynamics, and it's far from resolved.
Now, how have Western powers typically viewed Ethiopia in this strategic landscape?
Historically, there's been this kind of dual lens. On one hand, seeing Ethiopia as this predominantly Christian nation, an ancient civilization, in a region often perceived as volatile and largely Muslim majority. This created a certain cultural affinity, perhaps.
And the other lens.
The strategic ally lens. Especially post 9/11. Ethiopia became a key partner in counterterrorism efforts, particularly against al-Shabaab in Somalia. It contributed troops to peacekeeping missions, provided intelligence cooperation.
And this strategic alignment translated into tangible support.
Oh, absolutely. Significant financial aid development and humanitarian and military support, training, equipment. This support often continued even when Western governments raised concerns about Ethiopia's internal governance or human rights record. The strategic priorities often seem to outweigh those concerns.
So given that reliance on Western support, how much real agency does Ethiopia have? Does that counterterrorism focus, for example, end up shaping their domestic policies in ways they wouldn't otherwise choose?
That's a really critical question, and the sources offer different perspectives. On one hand, yes, the dependency on aid does grant external actors leverage. We saw examples during the Tigray War where some Western countries did suspend or threaten to suspend aid to push for humanitarian access or peace talks.
So there is leverage there.
There is. But Ethiopia isn't just passively accepting this. Especially under Abiy, there's been a push towards greater assertiveness, towards diversifying partnerships. Look at the closer ties with China, which offers infrastructure investment, often with fewer conditions attached. Look at engagement with Russia, Turkey, Gulf states. And joining BRICS is a very clear signal of wanting to reduce over-reliance on the West and enhance its strategic autonomy.
So the balancing act.
A complex balancing act. The focus on counterterrorism has definitely been criticized internally and externally. Critics argue that broad anti-terrorism lies have sometimes been used to stifle legitimate political dissent, enabling more authoritarian tendencies. It's a constant tension between security partnerships and democratic principles.
Okay, this feels like a good point to zoom back in on one of those core internal dynamics we mentioned. the Amhara-Tigray rivalry.
Yeah.
We touched on it, but let's really get into how deep this runs and also bring Eritrea back into the picture more explicitly.
Yes, that rivalry is fundamental. It's not just about recent politics, it's deeply entrenched. These are two groups with interconnected histories, both predominantly Orthodox Christian, both speaking Semitic languages, but also a long, long history of competition for power and influence.
How did that play out historically?
Well, the Solomonic dynasty, which ruled for centuries, had strong Amhara roots, culturally and linguistically. Amharic became the language of the court, the administration, the lingua franca of the empire. This naturally gave the Amhara a dominant position. But Tigray also has its own claims to historical prominence. The ancient Aksumite kingdom was centered there. They see themselves as sort of the cradle of Ethiopian civilization, so there's always been this undercurrent of competition, even when they were part of the same empire.
Then 1991 happens, the EPRDF takes power, led by the TPLF. That must have completely flipped the script.
Completely. Suddenly, the Tigrayans, representing maybe 6–7% of the population, were perceived as holding disproportionate power within the ruling coalition for almost 3 decades. This period created a whole new layer of grievances, but this time it was often the Amhara who felt marginalized. They felt sidelined politically and economically.
And those territorial disputes became central, right? Welkite, Raya.
Absolutely. Amhara nationalists felt those areas were historically theirs and had been unfairly incorporated into the Tigray region under TPLF rule. This became a major rallying point for Amhara nationalism and fueled deep resentment against the TPLF-dominated system. It was a real shift from Amhara dominance to what many perceived as Tigrayan hegemony.
So when Haramek came in 2018 and started dismantling the TPLF's influence.
Initially, that aligned perfectly with Amhara interests. Many Amhara elites and regional forces saw Abiy as an ally against their common rival, the TPLF. There was a temporary tactical alliance.
But temporary is the key word.
It seems so. Because as Abiy pushed his own vision of a more centralized, unified Ethiopia under the Prosperity Party, that also started to clash with Amhara demands for greater regional autonomy and, critically, their claims over those disputed territories. When the Tigray War broke out, Amhara forces moved into western Tigray, cementing their control. But post-war, tensions have flared up between the federal government and Amhara regional forces, including the Fano militia.
So the rivalry evolved again.
It did. It's now this incredibly complex struggle. It involves ideology, centralized state versus ethnic federalism. It involves economic competition over land and resources. And it's fundamentally a struggle for political dominance, for hegemony, with both sides constantly invoking their versions of history, their glorious paths, to legitimize their claims.
And into this already volatile mix steps Eritrea. We know they intervened militarily in Tigray alongside the federal government, but what were their specific motivations? It seems more than just helping Abiy.
Oh, definitely. Eritrea's motivations are complex, multi-layered, and centered on its own regime's interests, particularly those of President Isaias Afwerki. The number one driver was almost certainly to neutralize, if not destroy, the TPLF. Afwerki viewed the TPLF as a bitter enemy, dating back to the brutal 1998-2000 border war, and saw them as an existential threat to his own rule in Asmara. He likely saw the conflict as a golden opportunity to deal a decisive blow.
Beyond just enmity with the TPLF, were there other goals? Economic, maybe? Regional influence?
Quite possibly, some analysts suggest Eritrea hoped for greater economic integration, perhaps regaining access to Ethiopian markets or transit trade through Eritrean ports like Assab and Massawa, which were crucial before the border war. Regime survival is always paramount for Afwerki, so weakening a hostile TPLF served that goal directly. And perhaps there was an element of wanting to reassert Eritrean influence in the Horn, positioning itself as a key regional player alongside a potentially weakened Ethiopia.
And the impact of Eritrea's involvement?
Profoundly negative and complicating, by most accounts in the sources. It undeniably exacerbated ethnic tensions. Eritrean troops were accused of horrific It also raised serious questions about Ethiopian sovereignty for many Ethiopians having a foreign army deeply involved in an internal conflict. It contributed massively to the humanitarian catastrophe, hindering aid access in areas they controlled. And it further destabilized the region, risking wider conflict. Eritrea's role was, and remains, deeply controversial and damaging.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial point we need to consider. The fragility of the Ethiopian state itself, and the role of external, particularly Western support. Is it fair to hypothesize that without that significant Western financial and military backing, Ethiopia might have faced a more severe state collapse, maybe something akin to Somalia, during recent crises like the Tigray War?
It's a very plausible hypothesis, and the sources suggest Western backing played a critical role in preventing a worst-case scenario. Let's break it down. Financially, we're talking hundreds of millions annually in development and humanitarian aid from the US and EU alone, plus crucial multi-billion-dollar loans from the IMF and World Bank that keep the macroeconomy afloat.
So that aid directly mitigated the humanitarian crisis.
Absolutely. It provided life-saving food, medicine, and shelter for millions affected by conflict and drought. Without it, the death toll from starvation and disease would likely have been far, far higher, potentially leading to uncontrollable social breakdown. Economically, that support helped stabilize the currency, manage debt, and prevent a complete economic meltdown, which often precedes state collapse. Militarily, while direct intervention wasn't the case like in some other conflicts, years of Western training, equipment, and intelligence sharing had undoubtedly built up the Ethiopian National Defense Forces capacity.
How does that compare to Somalia in the early 90s? The contrast seems stark.
It is stark. In Somalia, after the Siad Barre regime collapsed, there wasn't a functional central state for Western powers to consistently support in the same way. Interventions, like the US-led UN mission, were relatively short-lived, sometimes seen as fragmented, and arguably lacked a coherent long-term strategy for state building. Ethiopia, despite its deep problems, maintained a state structure, an army, institutions that external actors could engage with and support, even if critically. The nature and consistency of external engagement were fundamentally different. Now, interpreting why Somalia collapsed so completely is complex. Internal clan dynamics were huge, but the level of sustained external propping up seen in Ethiopia just wasn't there.
But this reliance creates vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
Leverage for those external actors.
Absolutely. That dependency grants considerable leverage. We saw it used, or attempted to be used, during the Tigray conflict with aid conditionality linking support to humanitarian access or peace negotiations. Donor governments, IFIs, they hold significant sway through the power of the purse.
Yet, as you mentioned, Ethiopia seems to be pushing back, diversifying.
Exactly. Ethiopia is acutely aware of this vulnerability. So, while maintaining ties with Western partners, it's actively cultivating relationships with China, Russia, Gulf states, Turkey, and joining platforms like BRICS. It's a clear strategy to reduce that dependency, gain more policy space, and enhance its strategic autonomy. It's trying to play multiple sides to maximize its options, a classic diplomatic balancing act.
So Ethiopia really is at a crossroads. Looking ahead, what are the plausible future scenarios outlined in the sources? Where could things go from here?
The sources tend to cluster around three broad, quite different potential trajectories. First, there's a sort of optimistic, though very challenging scenario. Sustained federalism with reforms.
What does that look like?
It means genuinely strengthening democratic institutions, not just paying lip service, really reforming the ethnic federal system, maybe finding ways to promote national unity alongside regional autonomy, ensuring more equitable resource distribution. It would require incredibly difficult political compromises, inclusive dialogue, and a real effort to heal those deep historical wounds. It's possible, but requires immense political will.
Okay, what's the second scenario?
Second, and maybe seen as more probable by some analysts given recent history, is B, resurgent authoritarianism. This would involve a return to, or maybe an intensification of, more centralized authoritarian rule, prioritizing state security above all else, suppressing ethnic demands, cracking down on dissent. For stability, potentially achieving a kind of short-term imposed stability, but the risk is that it deepens grievances, alienates large parts of the population, and sows the seeds for future, possibly even more violent, instability down the line. Pushing problems underground doesn't make them go away.
And the third most worrying scenario?
That's C, fragmentation. This is the nightmare scenario, really. A breakdown of the central state, potentially leading to Ethiopia splintering into multiple entities, perhaps along ethnic or regional lines, escalating regional conflicts, maybe even outright secessionist movements gaining ground. The Tigray War definitely raised fears of this quite acutely. The peace agreement averted the immediate existential threat to the state, perhaps, but those underlying fissures, those deep ethnic tensions and competing nationalisms, they haven't disappeared. If the political center can't hold, or if reforms fail, this remains a grim possibility.
And layered on top of all this political complexity are these powerful forces, demography and climate change. How do they influence these potential futures?
They act as massive multipliers, absolutely. First, demography. Ethiopia has this huge, rapidly growing, and incredibly young population. The median age is something like low 20s. Over 40% of the population is under 15. You've got this massive youth bulge.
A dividend or a danger?
Exactly. It could be a demographic dividend, a source of dynamism, innovation, economic growth if there are enough jobs, education opportunities. But if not, if you have millions of young people facing unemployment, frustration, lack of prospects, that's fuel for social unrest, recruitment for armed groups, instability. Add rapid urbanization to that, people moving to cities, often straining infrastructure and services, sometimes creating marginalized urban populations. It's a potent mix.
And then climate change. Ethiopia seems particularly vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable. We're seeing the impacts already. More frequent and severe droughts, especially in the lowlands, leading to devastating food insecurity, water scarcity, killing livestock, forcing displacement. Sources mentioned around 24 million people affected by drought since just 2020. That directly fuels conflict over scarce resources, grazing land, water points often along ethnic lines. Then you also have floods in other areas causing displacement and damage. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue here. It's a direct driver of conflict and instability. A threat multiplier, as the security experts call it.
So you have this large, young, increasingly urban population facing limited economic opportunities, and then climate change is making basic resources like water and land scarcer and less predictable.
Exactly. It's a powerful, potentially explosive combination. Addressing these demographic and climate pressures has to be part of any viable path toward stability. You can't separate the political challenges from these fundamental environmental and social stresses. They're deeply intertwined.
So bringing this all together as we wrap up, Ethiopia is just navigating this incredibly complex landscape. We've talked about the legacy of ethnic federalism, its promises, its perils, the deep historical roots of the Amhara-Tigray rivalry, Eritrea's complicating, often destabilizing influence, and this crucial but also leveraging role of Western support.
It really underscores that Ethiopia's future truly hinges on its ability to manage these profound internal tensions. That means finding a way to reform its political system, make it more inclusive, more equitable, address those historical grievances, and simultaneously grappling with these huge demographic shifts and the undeniable impacts of climate change. It's an incredibly delicate balancing act.
And as you mentioned, the stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Ethiopia, but for the entire region. This whole discussion really brings those key scholarly debates into sharp focus, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
is ethnic federalism inherently the problem? Or is it about how it was implemented, the lack of genuine power sharing?
Precisely. Or the role of external actors.
Yeah.
Is Western support essential scaffolding preventing collapse, or does it sometimes inadvertently prop up regimes that resist reform? There are no easy answers there.
And ultimately, what is the most viable path forward? More centralization, deeper federalism, some hybrid model we haven't seen yet.
These are the huge questions Ethiopians themselves are grappling with, and the international community is watching closely.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Given this intricate web, we've explored the history, the identities, the external pressures, the internal fractures. How do you think a nation, any nation really, but especially one like Ethiopia, truly forges a shared national identity when its very constitutional structure is designed along ethnic lines, and those lines themselves have been the source of so much historical conflict and competition? Something to think about.